Deep in the Cascade Mountains of Oregon, where morning mist clings to ancient pine trees and silence stretches for miles, there stands a figure that defies explanation. Locals in the valley below call him the mountain giant, though none have ever spoken to him directly. For 37 years, Marcus Thorne has lived alone on the highest peak of Mount Serenity, visible only as a distant silhouette against the sky. The townspeople of Cedar Falls watch him through telescopes, tell stories about him in hushed voices, and create elaborate theories about his past. But not one person has ever climbed that treacherous mountain to simply say hello. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. That is, until Emma Rodriguez arrived in town with a backpack full of recording equipment and a heart full of stories that nobody wanted to hear. Emma Rodriguez had been a journalist for 12 years before she lost her voice. Not literally, her vocal cords worked just fine. But in a world obsessed with breaking news and viral content, her thoughtful feature stories about forgotten communities and overlooked lives had become invisible. The newspaper industry was dying. Magazines were cutting staff, and everyone wanted content that could be consumed in 30 seconds or less. Emma's carefully crafted narratives about elderly craftsmen, immigrant families, and small-town mysteries gathered dust in digital archives, while clickbait headlines dominated the front pages. The final blow came on a Tuesday morning in Chicago. Her editor, Janet Walsh, called her into the glass-walled office that smelled perpetually of stale coffee and deadline anxiety. "Emma, we need to talk." Janet's fingers drummed against her desk, a nervous habit that had intensified over the past year as circulation numbers plummeted. "I'm going to be straight with you. Your stories are beautiful. They're well-written, thoroughly researched, and they touch the heart, but they don't generate clicks." Emma felt something cold settle in her stomach. The piece about the Syrian family who opened the bakery downtown got shared over 3,000 times. 3,000 isn't 30,000. Janet's voice carried the weight of corporate pressure and impossible metrics. "I fought for you, Emma. I really did. But corporations want content that moves fast, generates engagement, creates controversy. Your stories make people think, but they don't make people react." The conversation lasted 23 minutes, but Emma would remember only the ending. "We're restructuring the lifestyle section. Your position is being eliminated effective immediately." Emma walked out of that building carrying a cardboard box filled with notebooks, press passes, and a small succulent plant named Gerald that had survived 3 office relocations. At 34 years old, she found herself unemployed in an industry that no longer valued the kind of stories she knew how to tell. For 6 months, she applied to every media outlet within a 100-mile radius of Chicago. She pitched freelance articles to magazines, offered her services to websites, and even considered writing marketing copy for tech startups. The responses were either polite rejections or deafening silence. Her savings account dwindled. Her confidence crumbled. The stories inside her head multiplied, but there was nowhere for them to go. That's when she discovered the forum. It started innocently enough, a Reddit thread about unexplained phenomena in the Pacific Northwest. Someone had posted a blurry photograph of a tall figure standing on a mountain peak, barely visible against the evening sky. The comments were typical internet fare: jokes, skeptical analysis, demands for better evidence. But buried deep in the thread was a comment from a user named Pine Falls 47 that caught Emma's attention. "I've lived in Cedar Falls my whole life, and I can tell you that figure isn't a hoax. His name is Marcus, and he's been up there since before I was born. My grandfather used to leave supplies at the base of the mountain: food, medical supplies, books. They'd always be gone the next day, but we never saw him come down to get them. Grandfather said Marcus used to be a professor or something, but something happened that made him retreat up there. Nobody bothers him, and he doesn't bother anybody. It's just how things are." Emma stared at her laptop screen for a long time, reading and rereading that comment. Here was a story that had apparently been unfolding for decades in a small Oregon town, and nobody had ever written about it. A man who had chosen complete isolation, a community that respected his solitude, a mystery that had become part of the local fabric. It was exactly the kind of human interest story that Emma specialized in: complex, layered, requiring patience and understanding rather than sensationalism. She bought a bus ticket to Cedar Falls. The next morning, the town was smaller than she had expected, with a population of just under 3,000 people spread across a valley surrounded by towering evergreens. Main Street consisted of a hardware store, a diner called Maggie's Kitchen, a small grocery store, and a combination post office and coffee shop named Mountain View Cafe. The buildings were well maintained but weathered, carrying the particular patina of a community that had learned to sustain itself without much outside attention. Emma rented a room at the Cedar Falls Inn, a 12-room establishment run by Dorothy and Frank Chun, a couple who had moved to Oregon from San Francisco 30 years earlier seeking a quieter life. Dorothy was a former librarian with silver hair and sharp eyes who seemed to know everyone's story before they finished telling it. "You're the journalist," Dorothy said when Emma checked in, though Emma hadn't mentioned her profession. Word travels fast in a small town. People are curious about why someone would come all the way from Chicago to write about Marcus. "How did you? Agnes Fletcher saw you taking pictures of the mountain from the town square." She called her daughter Linda, who works at the post office. Linda mentioned it to Tom Rodriguez at the grocery store. "No relation to you, different Rodriguez." And Tom told his wife Sarah, who cuts hair at the salon next to the diner. "Sarah's client this morning was my neighbor Beth Sullivan, and Beth stopped by to borrow some eggs and mentioned there was a reporter in town asking about the mountain giant." Dorothy smiled. "That's how information works here. Nothing stays secret long." Emma spent her first week in Cedar Falls, learning the rhythm of the town and gathering pieces of Marcus Thorey. She sat in Maggie's kitchen every morning, nursing coffee and listening to conversations at neighboring tables. She browsed the hardware store and struck up casual conversations with customers. She volunteered to help shelve books at the tiny local library, where the librarian, Mrs. Patterson, proved to be a treasure trove of local history. The picture that emerged was both fascinating and heartbreaking. Marcus Thorne had indeed been a professor, specifically a professor of literature at Pacific University in Portland. He had specialized in American poetry and was apparently brilliant at his work. But in 1987, when he was 32 years old, something had happened that caused him to abandon his career, his home, and all human contact. "It was a tragedy," Mrs. Patterson confided one afternoon as they sorted through donated books. "His wife and daughter were killed in a car accident. Drunk driver ran a red light downtown Portland. Marcus was supposed to be in that car too, but he had stayed late at the university to finish grading papers." Emma felt her chest tighten. "So he came here to grieve?" "He came here to disappear," Mrs. Patterson corrected. "He bought the land on Mount Serenity through a lawyer. Had a small cabin built up there. The construction crew said he supervised the whole project but barely spoke a word to anyone. When it was finished, he moved up there and hasn't come down since. Not once in 37 years. Well, people have theories about that." Mrs. Patterson lowered her voice conspiratorially. "Some folks think he comes down at night sometimes, maybe to get supplies from the cache that people leave at the base of the mountain. Others swear they've seen smoke from his chimney, so he must have some way of getting food and fuel up there. But nobody's ever actually seen him in town." Emma learned the people of Cedar Falls had developed an unusual relationship with their mountain hermit. Rather than treating him as a curiosity or trying to exploit his story for tourism, they had collectively decided to protect his privacy. They left supplies at a specific location at the base of Mount Serenity a weathered wooden platform built decades ago by a group of local volunteers. Food, medicines, books, warm clothing, and practical supplies appeared there regularly, donated anonymously by various townspeople. "It's not charity," explained Rick Martinez, who ran the hardware store and was one of the primary organizers of the supply runs. "It's respect. The man chose solitude, and we honor that choice. But we're not going to let him starve or freeze to death up there." "Has anyone ever tried to talk to him?" Emma asked. Rick shook his head. "Few people have hiked partway up the mountain over the years, hunters, hikers, curious teenagers. But there's an unspoken understanding that you don't go all the way to the top. That's his space. What if he wants to be left alone?" "Then he's got the right place for it," Rick replied. "But what if he doesn't?" The question haunted Emma for days. She had come to Cedar Falls expecting to find a simple human interest story about an eccentric hermit and a quirky small town. Instead, she had discovered something much more complex, a community that had spent nearly 4 decades respecting a man's grief while simultaneously wondering if their respect had become a prison. Emma began spending hours each day at the town's small park, which offered the clearest view of Mount Serenity's peak. She brought binoculars and a telephoto camera lens, not to invade Marcus's privacy, but to understand the geography of his solitude. The cabin was barely visible, just a speck of darker brown against the green of the pine forest. Sometimes she could see smoke rising from what must be a chimney. Occasionally, she caught glimpses of a tall figure moving around the property, too distant to make out any details, but clearly human, clearly alive. She interviewed dozens of townspeople, collecting fragments of the Marcus Thorne story. Everyone had an opinion about him, but nobody had facts beyond the basic tragedy that had driven him to the mountain. He had become less a person than a myth, a projection of whatever the people of Cedar Falls needed him to be. Some saw him as a romantic figure, a poet living in noble isolation. Others viewed him as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unprocessed grief. A few considered him selfish for abandoning his responsibilities to the world, but Emma began to notice something else in these conversations. The people of Cedar Falls were also isolated in their own way. They lived in a town that the modern world had largely forgotten, surrounded by natural beauty but cut off from the cultural and economic currents that animated larger communities. Many of them had stories of their own that nobody wanted to hear tales of family histories, personal struggles, small triumphs, and quiet sorrows that would never make headlines or generate clicks. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Margaret Foster, the elderly woman who ran the post office, had been a professional dancer in New York before a knee injury ended her career and brought her home to care for her aging parents. She had never married, never had children, and spent her days sorting mail and managing the small cafe while dreaming of stages she would never dance on again. James Wright, the mechanic who kept the town's aging vehicles running, had invented several small improvements to engine design that had been purchased by major manufacturers for modest sums. He held 3 patents and could have made a fortune if he had been willing to move to Detroit or Silicon Valley, but he preferred his small garage and the satisfaction of fixing problems with his hands, rather than managing corporate teams. Sarah Kim, the teacher at Cedar Falls Elementary, had a master's degree in education from Stanford and could have worked at any prestigious private school in the country. Instead, she chose to teach 15 students across 3 grade levels because she believed that rural children deserved the same quality of education as their urban counterparts. Each person Emma met had a story worth telling, but none of them believed their stories mattered to the larger world. They had internalized the same message Emma had received from her editor. Their lives weren't sensational enough, dramatic enough, or unusual enough to capture attention in a media landscape that demanded constant stimulation. As her second week in Cedar Falls drew to a close, Emma found herself facing a dilemma. She had enough material to write a compelling feature story about Marcus Thorne and the town that protected his solitude. It was exactly the kind of thoughtful, human-centered journalism she loved to do. But she still had no publisher, no outlet willing to pay for a 5,000-word exploration of grief, community, and the meaning of isolation in modern America. More importantly, she was beginning to question whether she had the right to tell Marcus's story at all. He had spent 37 years trying to disappear from public view. Was it ethical for her to drag him back into the light, even with the best of intentions? The answer came to her on a Thursday evening as she sat in Mountain View Cafe, laptop open, struggling to write a query letter to pitch the story to magazines that would probably reject it. The cafe was nearly empty, just Emma, the barista, Tyler Jackson, who was studying community college textbooks between customers, and an elderly man named Walter Hughes, who came in every evening to read newspapers and drink decaf coffee. Walter was 91 years old and had lived in Cedar Falls his entire life, except for 3 years spent fighting in the Korean War. He had been a logger, a volunteer firefighter, and eventually the town's unofficial historian. His memory stretched back to before Marcus had arrived, and he remembered when Mount Serenity was just another peak without a story attached to it. "You know what I think about Marcus up there?" Walter said, looking up from his newspaper. Emma realized he had been watching her struggle with her laptop. "I think he's got stories too. 37 years of watching this valley change, watching people come and go, seeing seasons turn and wildlife move and weather patterns shift. Man sits in one place that long. He sees things the rest of us miss." Emma closed her laptop. "What kind of things?" "Everything," Walter replied. "The way morning light hits different parts of the forest depending on the time of year, which animals come out after storms, how many cars pass through town on average Tuesdays versus Saturdays. When the Harris family started having problems, their house is visible from up there, and he probably saw the fights happening in the yard months before they filed for divorce." Walter sipped his coffee and continued, "But who's going to listen to those stories? Man hasn't spoken to another human being in decades. Even if he wanted to share what he's learned, where would he do it? Can't exactly post it on social media. Or write a letter to the editor." The words hit Emma like a revelation. She had been thinking about Marcus as a subject for her journalism, but Walter was suggesting something entirely different. What if Marcus wasn't the story she needed to tell? What if Marcus was the audience she needed to find? That night Emma lay awake in her small room at the Cedar Falls Inn, staring at the ceiling and thinking about stories and listeners. She had spent months feeling like her work had no value because it didn't generate enough clicks or shares or advertising revenue. But metrics weren't the only measure of worth. A story told to the right listener, even an audience of one, could still matter. The next morning, Emma made a decision that would change everything. Instead of writing about Marcus Thorne, she would try to write for him. She packed her laptop, a thermos of coffee, and a sandwich into her hiking backpack. She laced up the sturdy boots she had bought at Rick Martinez's hardware store. And she began the long, steep climb up Mount Serenity to find a man who had spent 37 years avoiding human contact. The trail was rough and rarely used, marked only by occasional blazes carved into tree trunks decades earlier. Emma had to stop frequently to rest and navigate around fallen logs and washouts. Her breath came in short gasps as the altitude increased and the air thinned. By noon, she had covered less than half the distance to the summit, and her legs were trembling with fatigue, but she kept climbing, driven by a certainty she couldn't fully explain. Somewhere above her was a man who understood what it meant to be ignored, dismissed, rendered invisible by a world that had no patience for complexity or nuance. Marcus Thorne had chosen solitude, while Emma had had isolation thrust upon her. But the result was the same. They were both people with stories that nobody wanted to hear. As the afternoon sun slanted through the pine boughs and her shadow grew long on the trail, Emma Rodriguez continued her ascent toward a meeting that would transform both of their lives in ways neither could have imagined. The cabin appeared through the trees, like a mirage born of exhaustion and determination. Emma had been climbing for 7 hours, her water bottle empty for the last 2, when she finally crested the ridge that led to Marcus Thorne's sanctuary. The structure was larger than she had expected, not a rough hermit's shelter, but a well-built log home with a stone chimney, covered porch, and windows that caught the late afternoon light like amber gems. For several minutes, Emma stood at the tree line, hidden among the towering pines, trying to steady her breathing and gather her courage. Smoke drifted lazily from the chimney, and she could see neat stacks of firewood under the eaves, a small vegetable garden protected by chicken wire, and what appeared to be a workshop attached to the back of the house. This wasn't the desperate refuge of a broken man. This was a home, carefully tended and thoughtfully arranged. Movement caught her eye. A tall figure emerged from behind the cabin, carrying an armload of split logs. Even at this distance, she could see that Marcus Thorne moved with the easy confidence of someone completely at peace in his environment. His hair, now silver white, was pulled back in a ponytail. His clothes were practical flannel shirt, work pants, sturdy boots, but clean and well-maintained. He looked nothing like the wild hermit of local legend. Emma stepped out of the forest. Marcus froze mid-step when he saw her, logs balanced against his chest, his entire body going rigid with surprise. For a moment that stretched into eternity, they stared at each other across 50 yards of mountain meadow. Emma could see his face clearly now, weathered by decades of mountain weather, but intelligent, alert, and unmistakably startled by the presence of another human being. "Professor Thorne?" Emma called out, her voice carrying clearly in the thin mountain air. "My name is Emma Rodriguez. I'm not here to bother you. I just ... I wanted to tell you a story." Marcus didn't move. Didn't speak. The logs remained clutched against his chest like a barrier between himself and this unexpected intrusion. Emma took a careful step forward, then another. "I know this is your space, and I know you came here to be alone. But I'm a journalist who's lost her audience, and you're a literature professor who hasn't heard a new story in 37 years. I thought maybe we could help each other." Still no response. But Marcus hadn't retreated into the cabin or ordered her to leave. His dark eyes tracked her movement as she approached, wary but not hostile. When Emma was close enough to see the flecks of gray in his beard, she stopped walking and sat down cross-legged on the ground, making herself as non-threatening as possible. The gesture seemed to surprise Marcus. His shoulders relaxed slightly, though he remained poised to flee. "I'll make you a deal," Emma said, unzipping her backpack and pulling out her laptop. "I'll tell you a story that nobody else wants to hear. If you don't like it, I'll leave immediately and never come back. If you do like it, maybe you'll let me tell you another one tomorrow." Marcus finally moved, setting the logs down on the porch with deliberate care. He studied Emma with the intensity of someone who had forgotten how to read human expressions, but was trying to remember. When he spoke, his voice was rusty from disuse, but surprisingly gentle. "What kind of story?" The words hit Emma like electricity. After months of rejection and silence, someone was asking to hear what she had to say. She opened her laptop, grateful that she had remembered to charge it before beginning the climb. "It's about a woman named Patricia Kellerman who runs a small bakery in downtown Toledo, Ohio. She's 73 years old, and every morning for the past 47 years, she's arrived at her shop at 4 a.m. to make bread from scratch. But that's not the interesting part." Marcus moved closer, settling onto the porch steps where he could hear clearly while maintaining some distance. His attention was complete, focused with the intensity of someone who had been starved for human connection without realizing it. Interesting part, Emma continued, is that Patricia has been writing down every conversation she overhears in her bakery. Customer conversations, phone calls, arguments between couples, confessions between friends. She has 17 notebooks full of dialogue, thousands of pages of real human interaction that she's been documenting like an anthropologist studying her own species. Emma looked up from her screen to gauge Marcus's reaction. He was leaning forward slightly, his expression engaged in a way that reminded her of her best students back when she had briefly tried teaching journalism. Patricia told me she started writing things down because she realized that most conversations disappear forever the moment they end. All those small revelations, intimate moments, funny observations, heartbreaking admissions, they vanish as if they never happened. She wanted to preserve them somehow, even if nobody ever read them. The mountain wind rustled through the pines as Emma read excerpts from her interviews with Patricia Kellerman. She shared the story of the elderly man who came in every Tuesday to buy a single dinner roll and always asked if Patricia thought his late wife would be proud of how he was managing alone. She told Marcus about the young mother who brought her toddler to the bakery every Friday and quietly confided her fears about whether she was raising her daughter right. She described the businessman who stopped by each morning for coffee and a muffin, gradually revealing over months of brief exchanges that he was caring for his brother with Alzheimer's. Patricia has become the keeper of all these small stories, Emma explained. She knows who's getting divorced before the lawyers do. She knows who's struggling financially before the banks do. She knows who's falling in love before the couples admit it to themselves. But when I asked her why she never shared these observations with anyone, she said something that stuck with me. Emma paused, looking directly at Marcus. She said, "Who would want to listen to stories about ordinary people living ordinary lives? The world is full of more important things to pay attention to." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the distant valley below. When he spoke, his words came slowly, as if he was excavating thoughts that had been buried for decades. "I used to teach American literature," he said. "Walt Whitman, Emily Dickinson, Robert Frost, poets who found the extraordinary in the ordinary, who saw infinite complexity in simple human experiences. I spent years trying to help students understand that the most profound truths are often hidden in the most mundane moments." He stood up and walked to the edge of the porch, looking out over the forest that had been his only companion for so long, but I forgot that lesson when it mattered most. After Sarah and Lucy died, I couldn't see anything but the enormity of the loss. I forgot that grief is just another ordinary human experience, and that there might be something valuable in living through it rather than hiding from it. Emma felt something shift in the air between them, a recognition, a shared understanding of what it meant to lose faith in the value of their own experiences. "What would you have done with Patricia's notebooks?" Emma asked. "If you were still teaching?" Marcus smiled, the first genuine expression of pleasure Emma had seen cross his face. "I would have made them the centerpiece of a course on contemporary American voices. I would have had students analyze the patterns, the recurring themes, the evolution of individual speakers over time. Those notebooks are probably more valuable as primary source material than most published works. But nobody wants to read about a bakery in Toledo. Nobody wants to read Winnisburg, Ohio either, until someone shows them why it matters." Marcus turned back to Emma, and she could see something awakening in his expression, the intellectual excitement of a teacher who had just discovered a new text to explore. "The problem isn't with the stories. The problem is with how they're presented." Emma saved her document and closed the laptop. The sun was setting behind the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that no photograph could capture. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and she realized she hadn't planned for the descent in darkness. "I should start heading back," she said, though every instinct told her to stay and continue this conversation that felt more vital than any she'd had in months. Marcus hesitated, clearly wrestling with impulses he had suppressed for decades. "It gets dark quickly. Up here," he said finally. "And cold. The trail is dangerous at night, especially for someone who's not familiar with it. I have a flashlight. That's not enough." Marcus disappeared into the cabin and returned with a heavy sleeping bag and a camping pad. "You can sleep on the porch. I'll make sure you get down safely in the morning." Emma accepted the bedding with gratitude that went deeper than mere appreciation for practical help. Someone was taking care of her, showing concern for her welfare, treating her as a person whose safety mattered. After months of professional rejection and personal isolation, the simple human kindness felt overwhelming. As Marcus prepared a simple dinner of soup and bread, Emma set up her makeshift bed on the covered porch and watched the stars emerge in the clear mountain sky. The silence was profound, no traffic, no electronics, no urban hum, but it didn't feel empty. It felt full of potential, like a blank page waiting for the right story. "I have a question," Marcus said as they shared the meal. "Why journalism? What made you want to tell other people's stories?" Emma thought about her standard interview answer, something about democracy needing informed citizens and the importance of giving voice to the voiceless. But sitting here in this place that felt removed from all conventional expectations, she found herself telling the truth instead. "I think I became a journalist because I was always the kid who listened to adult conversations and noticed things that other people missed. My parents would have friends over for dinner, and while everyone else was focused on the main topics, politics, work, current events, I would pick up on the small details. The way someone's voice changed when they mentioned their ex-spouse. The fact that the couple in the corner touched each other less than they used to. The slight defensiveness when someone talked about their teenage daughter." She paused to sip the soup, which was surprisingly complex and flavorful for something prepared on a wood stove. "I realized that the real stories were usually happening in the margins of the official stories. The newspaper would report on a factory closing, but they wouldn't write about how the security guard who'd worked there for 20 years was learning to use a computer for the first time so he could apply for other jobs. The magazine would cover a celebrity divorce, but they wouldn't explore what it meant for the anonymous assistant who had spent years managing the details of a marriage that was falling apart behind closed doors." Marcus nodded slowly. "Literature does the same thing. The best novels aren't about the kings and heroes. They're about the servants and bystanders who witness history from unexpected angles." "Exactly. But somewhere along the way, the media industry decided that those marginal stories weren't profitable enough. Audiences wanted faster, louder, more sensational content. The kind of careful observation and patient storytelling that I loved became obsolete." "So you came here looking for a sensational story about a mountain hermit?" Emma laughed, recognizing the gentle challenge in his question. "I came here thinking I was looking for that, yes. But what I found was something better. I found someone who might actually want to hear the kind of stories I know how to tell." They talked until well past midnight, sharing experiences of intellectual isolation and creative frustration. Marcus described the strange evolution of his solitude, how it had begun as an escape from unbearable pain, but gradually transformed into something more complex. He had become an accidental observer of the natural world, developing an understanding of seasonal patterns, animal behavior, and ecological relationships that rivaled any formal scientific training. "I started keeping notes," he admitted. "Just observations at first when certain birds migrated, how weather patterns affected the forest, which plants bloomed in what sequence, but over the years, it became more elaborate. I have journals full of detailed records about this ecosystem, data that spans nearly 4 decades. Emma felt the familiar tingle of recognizing a significant story. "That's incredible research. Have you ever thought about sharing it with environmental scientists or researchers?" Marcus shook his head. "Who would want data collected by an amateur? I don't have credentials, methodology, peer review. It's just the observations of a lonely man with too much time on his hands. It's longitudinal field research conducted over 37 years by someone with advanced education and no commercial agenda, Emma corrected. Do you know how valuable that could be to climate scientists trying to understand long-term environmental changes? For the first time since she had arrived, Marcus looked genuinely surprised. I never thought of it that way. As Emma settled into her sleeping bag that night, listening to the sounds of the mountain wind in the trees, distant owl calls, the settling creaks of the cabin, she realized that both she and Marcus had been making the same mistake. They had internalized the judgment that their work didn't matter because it didn't fit conventional categories of importance or marketability. But value and visibility were not the same thing. Sometimes the most significant contributions were made by people working in obscurity, documenting truths that wouldn't be recognized until much later. The next morning, Emma woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of Marcus splitting firewood behind the cabin. The sunrise painted the eastern peaks in brilliant shades of pink and orange, and the air was crisp with the promise of autumn. She felt more rested than she had in months, despite sleeping on a porch in a sleeping bag. I have a proposal, she said over breakfast. You let me come back once a week, and I'll bring you stories from the outside world. Real stories, not news headlines or social media nonsense. Stories about people like Patricia Kellerman, who are living interesting lives that nobody pays attention. 2. In exchange, you tell me about what you've learned up here. The ecological observations, the patterns you've noticed, the insights that come from spending 37 years really paying attention to one place. Marcus considered this carefully, stirring sugar into his coffee with the slow deliberation of someone who had learned not to make hasty decisions. Why would you want to keep coming back up here? It's a difficult climb, and I'm not exactly stimulating company after all these years of isolation. Emma looked around at the peaceful mountain homestead, at this man who had listened to her stories with genuine interest and responded with thoughtful questions and observations. Because this is the first place in months where I feel like my work has value. Because you're the first person in a long time who's actually interested in hearing what I have to say. And because I think you might be lonely too, even if you won't. Admit it. Marcus was quiet for a long time, watching the hawk circle high above the valley. Finally he nodded. Wednesdays, he said. Come on Wednesdays, and I'll have coffee ready. As Emma packed her laptop and prepared for the descent, she felt something she hadn't experienced since losing her job: anticipation for the future. She had found her audience, an audience of one, perhaps, but someone who understood the value of careful observation and patient storytelling. Someone who had been waiting 37 years to hear new stories, even if he hadn't realized it himself. The hike down Mount Serenity took half the time of the ascent, but Emma moved carefully, already planning her return journey. She had stories to collect, a relationship to build, and the beginning of something that might become the most important work of her career. For the first time in months, Emma Rodriguez had somewhere to be on Wednesday morning, and someone who would be waiting to listen. Emma's second Wednesday on Mount Serenity arrived with the first snowfall of the season. She had spent the week in Cedar Falls collecting stories with a renewed sense of purpose, armed with the knowledge that someone would actually want to hear them. The trail was more treacherous now, slick with early frost and scattered with leaves that concealed loose rocks, but Emma climbed with growing confidence, her hiking boots finding purchase on familiar terrain. Marcus was waiting for her on the porch, 2 steaming mugs of coffee beside him and a thick notebook balanced on his knees. He looked different, somehow more alert, more present, as if having a weekly appointment with another human being had awakened something that had been dormant for decades. I've been thinking about your story all week, he said without preamble. As Emma settled into the rough-hewn chair he had dragged onto the porch for her visits, Patricia Kellerman and her notebooks. It reminded me of something I used to teach about the difference between history and story. Emma accepted the coffee. gratefully warming her hands around the ceramic mug. What's the difference? History is what gets recorded in official documents. Story is what actually happened to real people. Marcus opened his notebook, revealing pages covered in dense handwriting. I started wondering what stories I've been recording up here without realizing it. For the next hour, Marcus shared observations. That transformed Emma's understanding of what he had been doing during his decades of solitude. He hadn't simply been hiding from the world. He had been documenting it with the precision of a scientist and the insight of a poet. He told her about the family of black bears that had denned in the same cluster of rocks for 13 consecutive winters, and how their behavior had gradually shifted as climate change brought warmer temperatures and altered their hibernation patterns. He described the subtle changes in bird migration timing, noting species that now arrived 2 weeks earlier than they had in the 1990s, and others that had stopped coming to this elevation entirely. There's a pair of ravens that have nested in the same dead pine for 8 years, Marcus said, pointing toward a skeletal tree visible from the porch. They've raised 23 chicks in that time. But this year, they built a second nest 50 yards higher up the mountain. I think they're responding to temperature changes that I can barely detect, but they've been sensing for months. Emma found herself taking notes, recognizing the scientific value of Marcus's long-term observations. But there was something else. In his stories, a deep emotional connection to the creatures and landscape he had been watching. He spoke about individual animals with the affection of someone discussing old friends. You're not just recording data, Emma realized. You're documenting relationships. Marcus looked surprised. I suppose I am. When you watch the same hawk hunt the same meadow for 15 years, when you know which tree a particular owl will call from based on the weather, when you can predict where the deer will shelter during storms, it stops feeling like observation and starts feeling like conversation. Even though they can't talk back, who says they can't? Marcus smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face. They communicate constantly. The trick is learning their language. Emma spent that morning learning to see the mountain through Marcus's eyes. He showed her how to read the subtle signs that predicted weather changes. The way certain birds altered their feeding patterns before storms, the position of cloud formations that indicated wind direction shifts, the behavior of pine needles. That revealed atmospheric pressure changes hours before human instruments would register them. Weather services forecast what's happening in the valley, Marcus explained as they walked around his property. But mountains create their own weather systems. I've learned to predict conditions up here with more accuracy than any meteorologist. Because I'm reading the actual environment instead of computer models. Emma documented everything, not just for her own interest, but because she was beginning to understand that Marcus's knowledge represented something irreplaceable. He had become a human instrument for measuring environmental change, his observations spanning nearly 4 decades of climate data that existed nowhere else. But the real revelation came when Emma shared her second story. She had spent the previous week interviewing Helen Vasquez, a night shift nurse at Cedar Falls General Hospital who had been working the same schedule for 22 years. Helen's story was ostensibly about healthcare in rural communities, but Emma had discovered something much more complex during their conversations. Helen has developed an almost supernatural ability to predict medical crises, Emma told Marcus, as they sat by his wood stove later that afternoon. She can sense when a patient is going to take a turn for the worse hours before any clinical signs appear. Other staff members have started calling her the Oracle because her instincts are so accurate. Marcus leaned forward, immediately engaged. How does she do it? That's what I wanted to know. So I followed her through several shifts, watching how she worked. Emma pulled out her notes, though she barely needed them after spending so much time thinking about Helen's methods. She notices things that other people dismiss as irrelevant. The way a patient's breathing changes subtly during sleep. How family members position themselves around a bedside. The particular quality of silence in a room where someone is struggling. Pattern recognition, Marcus said immediately. After 22 years of constant observation, she's internalized thousands of microsignals that predict outcomes. Exactly. But when I asked Helen about it, she insisted it wasn't anything special. She said any nurse would develop the same instincts if they paid attention. She was almost apologetic about her abilities, as if being exceptionally good at reading human distress was somehow embarrassing. Marcus was quiet for a moment, staring into the flames dancing behind the stove's glass door. We do that, don't we? Minimize our own expertise because it feels presumptuous to claim knowledge that can't be easily quantified. Helen saved 17 lives last year through early interventions that other staff members would have missed. Emma continued. 17 people went home to their families because she trusted observations that seemed insignificant to everyone else. But she's never been recognized for it because her skill doesn't fit into standard medical protocols. How do you quantify intuition developed through decades of careful attention? Marcus asked. How do you put pattern recognition on a resume? Emma realized they were talking about more than Helen Vasquez now. They were talking about the broader problem of expertise that developed outside institutional frameworks knowledge. That was profound but difficult to legitimize within conventional systems. I've been thinking about that, Emma said. You, Helen, Patricia Kellerman, you're all people who've developed extraordinary insights through long-term observation and attention. But because your knowledge doesn't come with degrees or official credentials, it gets dismissed as anecdotal or amateur. Marcus stood up and moved to one of his bookshelves, selecting a volume that Emma recognized as a collection of Robert Frost's poetry. He flipped through the pages until he found what he was looking for. The woods are lovely, dark and deep, he read aloud. But I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep. I used to teach this poem as being about duty and obligation. But sitting up here for 37 years, I think Frost was writing about something else entirely. What? The tension between deep observation and social responsibility. The speaker is drawn to stay in the woods, to keep watching and learning from what he sees there. But he has promises to keep obligations to the human world that require him to leave this place of profound attention and return to society. Emma felt something click into place. You think Frost was struggling with the same choice you made? Between solitude that enables deep observation and engagement that allows you to share what you've learned? I chose the woods, Marcus said simply. I stayed to watch and learn. But I never found a way to honor the promises to bring what I discovered back to the world. The conversation that followed changed everything for both of them. Marcus began to describe his growing awareness that his decades of isolation, while personally necessary, had also been professionally irresponsible. He had accumulated knowledge that could benefit climate researchers, wildlife biologists, and environmental policymakers, but his self-imposed exile had made that knowledge inaccessible. Emma, meanwhile, realized that her frustration with modern journalism wasn't just about career disappointment. It was about the fundamental mismatch between the kind of deep, patient observation that produced meaningful insights and the rapid-fire content cycles that dominated contemporary media. What if there was another way? Emma asked as the afternoon light began to fade. What if we didn't have to choose between careful observation and sharing what we learn? Marcus looked at her with curiosity. What do you mean? I mean, what if we created our own platform? Something that valued long-term observation over immediate reaction, that prioritized depth over speed, that gave people like Helen and Patricia and you a place to share expertise that doesn't fit conventional categories. Emma's idea was audacious in its simplicity. Instead of trying to convince existing media outlets to publish stories about overlooked experts, they would create a new kind of publication, one designed specifically for people whose knowledge came from decades of careful attention rather than formal credentials. We could call it The Long View, Emma suggested, her excitement building as she spoke. Monthly stories about people who've been watching, listening, and learning for years. Helen's medical intuition, your ecological observations, Patricia's documentation of human conversation. Stories that matter precisely because they unfold over time. Marcus was intrigued but skeptical. Who would read it? If mainstream publications don't want these stories, why would readers? Because there are more people like us than we realize, Emma replied. People who are tired of surface-level content, who want to understand how the world actually works instead of just reacting to whatever crisis is trending this week. People who value expertise, even when it comes without official certification. They spent the rest of the afternoon sketching out possibilities. Marcus's scientific training proved invaluable in thinking through methodology, how to verify observations, establish credibility, and present findings in ways that would be taken seriously by academic communities. Emma's journalism background provided insight into storytelling techniques that could make complex observations accessible to general readers. By the time Emma prepared to leave that evening, they had outlined the framework for something unprecedented. A publication that would bridge the gap between academic research and popular journalism by focusing on citizen experts whose long-term observations provided unique insights into environmental, social, and cultural changes. There's one problem, Marcus said as Emma shouldered her backpack. I can't be the public face of this project. I'm not ready for that level of exposure. Emma had anticipated this concern. You don't have to be. I'll handle all the public aspects, interviews, promotion, distribution. Your role is behind-the-scenes editorial oversight, methodology development, quality control. You'd be the academic rigor behind the project without having to leave the mountain. Marcus considered this carefully. And you think people will actually want to read about a nurse's intuition and a hermit's weather observations? I think people are starving for content that treats them as intelligent beings capable of appreciating complexity, Emma replied. I think they're tired of being told that their own observations don't matter unless they go viral. And I think there are more Helen Vasquezes and Patricia Kellermans out there than we can imagine, people with valuable insights who've never had a platform to share them. As Emma began her descent in the gathering dusk, she carried with her more than just notes for another story. She carried the outline of a project that could transform how expertise was recognized and shared, that could give voice to people whose knowledge had been developed through patience and attention rather than formal study. Behind her, Marcus stood on his porch watching her headlamp bob down the mountain trail. For the first time in 37 years, he was thinking seriously about rejoining the world, not by leaving his sanctuary, but by finding a way to make his sanctuary useful to others. The next Wednesday, Emma arrived to find Marcus waiting with something she hadn't expected: a detailed proposal for the long view, complete with editorial guidelines, contributor criteria, and a methodology for verifying unconventional expertise. He had spent the week applying his academic training to the challenge of creating a new kind of publication, one that could honor both rigorous observation and accessible storytelling. I have one condition, Marcus said as they reviewed his proposal. Over coffee. We don't just collect these stories. We connect the storytellers. Helen should know about Patricia's conversation notebooks. Patricia should understand the value of your journalism instincts. I want to create a community of people who pay attention. Emma looked up from the pages, realizing that Marcus had envisioned something even more ambitious than she had imagined. Not just a publication, but a network of citizen experts who could learn from each other's methods and observations. A community of watchers, she said. A community of listeners, Marcus corrected. People who understand that the most important stories are usually the ones no one thinks to tell. That afternoon, Emma sent her first email from Marcus's cabin he had maintained. Internet service for weather data and supply ordering, though he rarely used it for communication. The message went to Helen Vasquez at Cedar Falls General Hospital, asking if she would be interested in corresponding with a former literature professor who had spent decades developing his own methods for pattern recognition and prediction. Helen's response arrived within hours. "I thought I was the only one who saw things other people miss. I'd love to compare notes." By the time Emma descended the mountain that evening, the long view had its first two contributors and a methodology for finding others. More importantly, it had something that neither Emma nor Marcus had possessed individually: a sense of purpose. That connected solitary observation to community building, that transformed isolated expertise into collaborative knowledge. Emma Rodriguez had climbed Mount Serenity looking for a story about a hermit. Instead, she had found a partner in creating something entirely new, a platform for the kind of patient, thoughtful attention that the modern world desperately needed but rarely rewarded. And Marcus Thorne had discovered that keeping his promises to the world didn't require abandoning the deep observation that had sustained him for nearly 4 decades. The mountain giant was finally ready to share his stories. But more importantly, he was ready to listen to others tell theirs. 3 months after The Long View published its first issue, Emma found herself sitting in the offices of Pacific Northwest Environmental Research Institute, facing Dr. Amanda Richardson, one of the region's most respected climate scientists. The meeting had been months in the making, arranged after Dr. Richardson read Marcus's detailed observations about changing precipitation patterns in the Cascade Mountains. "I've been studying climate change in this region for 15 years, Dr. Richardson said, spreading Marcus's handwritten charts across her desk. "And I've never seen data this granular or this consistent. Your colleague has documented microclimate variations that our weather stations completely miss." Emma watched the scientist trace her finger along Marcus's meticulous recordings of daily temperature fluctuations, seasonal shifts, and precipitation timing. Each entry was dated, cross-referenced with barometric pressure readings, and annotated with observations about corresponding changes in plant and animal behavior. "The problem is verification," Dr. Richardson continued. "Academic institutions require peer review, controlled methodology, calibrated instruments. Your friend's observations are fascinating, but they're not scientifically legitimate without proper documentation." This was the challenge Emma had been wrestling with for weeks. The Long View had attracted a growing readership of people hungry for thoughtful, long-term perspectives on complex issues. But translating citizen expertise into academic credibility required navigating institutional barriers that seemed designed to exclude exactly the kind of knowledge Marcus possessed. "What would it take to make his work legitimate?" Emma asked. "Collaboration." Dr. Richardson replied immediately. "If your colleague would allow us to install weather monitoring equipment on his property and work with our graduate students to standardize his observation methods, we could co-author papers that would give his data the academic standing it deserves." Emma's heart sank. She knew Marcus would never agree to graduate students tramping around his sanctuary, installing equipment that would destroy the very solitude that had enabled his observations in the first place. "There has to be another way," she said. Dr. Richardson studied Marcus's charts again, clearly torn between professional protocol and scientific curiosity. "There might be. What if we created a new category of research collaboration? Citizen scientist partnerships where long-term observers like your colleague work with academic institutions while maintaining their independence." The conversation that followed changed Emma's understanding of what The Long View could become. Instead of simply publishing stories about overlooked experts, they could create bridges between citizen observers and academic institutions, facilitating collaborations that honored both rigorous methodology and unconventional wisdom. 2 weeks later, Emma climbed Mount Serenity with a proposal that would test Marcus's willingness to engage with the world without compromising his solitude. She found him in his workshop, A space she had never seen before, a converted room filled with hand-carved furniture, detailed sketches of local wildlife, and shelves lined with specimens he had collected over the decades. "I didn't know you were an artist," Emma said, examining an intricate carving of a red-tailed hawk that captured both the bird's physical form and something ineffable about its wild essence. "I'm not," Marcus replied, not looking up from the piece he was working on, a relief sculpture of the mountain's topography that showed seasonal changes in vegetation patterns. "I'm just trying to understand what I see by reproducing it with my hands." Emma realized that Marcus's artistic work was another form of scientific observation, a way of studying the natural world through careful attention to detail and form. The carvings weren't decorative objects, they were three-dimensional research. "Notes: Dr. Richardson wants to collaborate with you," Emma said, explaining the meeting and the scientist's proposal for partnership. Marcus set down his carving tools and listened carefully as Emma outlined the possibilities for Kiva academic collaboration. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time, examining his hands as if seeing them for the first time. "I've been avoiding this conversation for months," he said finally. "Part of me wants to contribute to climate research, to make sure my observations don't die with me. But another part of me is terrified that academic collaboration will turn this place into something it was never meant to be." "What was it meant to be?" Marcus gestured toward the window where the afternoon light was painting the distant peaks. "In shades of gold and amber, a place for paying attention, for watching without being watched, for learning without having to prove what I've learned to anyone else." Emma understood his dilemma better than he might have expected. She had spent her career navigating the tension between professional recognition and creative integrity, between sharing knowledge and protecting the conditions that made knowledge possible. "What if the collaboration happened on your terms?" she suggested. "What if Dr. Richardson's team could access your data without accessing your space? What if you could contribute to academic research while maintaining complete control over how and when you engage?" They spent the rest of the afternoon designing a collaboration model that had never been attempted before. Marcus would continue his observations using methods he had developed over decades, but he would also work with Dr. Richardson's team to ensure his data collection met academic standards. Graduate students would analyze his findings remotely, and any publications would acknowledge him as a co-author, without requiring his physical presence at conferences or meetings. Most importantly, Marcus would retain veto power over any research that used his data. If academic collaboration began to compromise his ability to observe and document environmental changes, he could withdraw from the partnership without explanation or penalty. "It's unprecedented," Emma admitted. "Academic institutions don't usually give citizen scientists this much control over research partnerships." "Then maybe it's time for academic institutions to change," Marcus replied. "If they really value long-term environmental observation, they need to support the conditions that make such observation possible." The arrangement they negotiated over the following weeks became a model for the Longview's evolving mission. Emma found herself serving as a translator between citizen experts and institutional researchers, helping to create collaborations that preserve the independence of long-term observers while making their knowledge accessible to academic communities. Helen Vasquez, the intuitive nurse, began working with medical researchers at Oregon Health and Science University to develop new protocols for early crisis detection. Her methods for reading subtle patient cues were being systematized into training materials that could help other nurses develop similar observational skills. Patricia Kellerman's conversation notebooks became the foundation for a linguistics research project examining how regional dialects and social patterns were changing in small American cities. Graduate students were analyzing her documentation of speech patterns, discovering linguistic shifts that traditional academic research had completely missed. But the most significant development came from an unexpected source. Emma was in Cedar Fall's interviewing a new subject for The Long View when Dorothy Chun, the innkeeper, approached her with a worn leather journal. "I've been reading your magazine," Dorothy said, "and I think I might have something that would interest you and Professor Thorne." The journal belonged to Dorothy's grandfather, Jiang Wei, who had immigrated to Oregon in 1923 and spent 47 years working as a cook in logging camps throughout the Cascade Mountains. Unlike most camp workers, Jiang Wei had kept detailed records of everything he observed during his decades in the forest. "He wrote in Chinese, so I never paid much attention to it," Dorothy explained. "But after reading about your friend's observations, I had my cousin translate a few pages." Grandfather was documenting the same kinds of environmental changes that Professor Thorne writes about, but starting 60 years earlier. Emma felt her pulse quicken as she examined the journal. Jiang Wei had recorded seasonal variations, animal behavior patterns, weather changes, and forest dynamics from the 1920s through the 1970s, providing a historical baseline for environmental conditions that predated modern climate monitoring by decades. "This could be invaluable for climate research," Emma told Dorothy. "Your grandfather's observations could help scientists understand how environmental changes began long before anyone was officially studying them." But Dorothy had a different concern. Grandfather never intended for anyone outside the family to read these journals. He was just trying to understand his new home by paying close attention to it. "I'm not sure it's right to make his private observations public." The ethical question Dorothy raised forced Emma to confront issues she hadn't fully considered before. The Long View was built on the premise that overlooked expertise deserved recognition and platform. But what about expertise that was never intended for public consumption? Did the scientific value of Jiang Wei's observations justify making them available to researchers without his consent? Emma brought the question to Marcus during her next Wednesday visit, along with photocopies of several translated pages from Jiang Wei's journal. Marcus read the entries with growing excitement, recognizing observations that complemented and validated his own environmental documentation. "This is extraordinary," he said. Jiang Wei was documenting the early stages of climate change before anyone knew what climate change was. His baseline data could reshape our understanding of when environmental shifts began in this region. "But we don't have his permission to use it," Emma pointed out. "He's been dead for 30 years, and his granddaughter is uncomfortable making his private observations public." Marcus set down the journal pages and looked out at the forest that had been his laboratory for nearly 4 decades. "I understand Dorothy's concern," he said slowly. "These journals represent something sacred, one person's patient attempt to understand the world around him. Making them public could honor that effort, or it could violate it. How do we decide?" "We ask what Jiang Wei would have wanted if he had known his observations could help future generations understand environmental change," Marcus replied. "And we make sure that any use of his work honors his memory and his family's concerns." The solution they developed became another model for the Long View's evolving ethical framework. Instead of simply publishing Jiang Wei's observations, they would work with Dorothy and her family to create a memorial project that honored her grandfather's legacy while making his environmental documentation available to researchers. Dorothy agreed to allow Jiang Wei's journals to be fully translated and digitized, but only under conditions that respected both his memory and her family's privacy. The climate data would be shared with academic researchers, but the personal reflections and cultural observations would remain private. Any scientific papers that used Jiang Wei's data would acknowledge him as a posthumous collaborator and include information about his life and contributions to environmental understanding. The project took 6 months to complete, but the results exceeded everyone's expectations. Jiang Wei's observations, combined with Marcus's contemporary data, provided climate scientists with nearly a century of consistent environmental monitoring from the same geographic region. The collaboration produced 3 peer-reviewed papers and established a new methodology for incorporating historical citizen science into contemporary climate research. More importantly, it demonstrated that the long view had evolved beyond simple storytelling into something more complex and valuable, a platform for translating overlooked expertise into actionable knowledge while preserving the dignity and autonomy of the experts themselves. By the end of Emma's first year of Wednesday visits to Mount Serenity, the Long View had published stories about 27 citizen experts and facilitated academic collaborations for 12 of them. The magazine's readership had grown to over 15,000 subscribers, and Emma was receiving inquiries from citizen scientists, academic researchers, and curious readers from across the United States. But the most significant change was in Marcus himself. While he maintained his solitude and continued his environmental observations, he had found a way to contribute to the world without compromising the conditions that made his contributions possible. His collaboration with Dr. Richardson had produced valuable climate research. His editorial oversight ensured the Long View maintained high standards for verifying citizen expertise, and his weekly conversations with Emma had rekindled intellectual engagement he thought he had lost forever. "I have a confession," Marcus told Emma during one of their Wednesday meetings as autumn painted the mountainside in brilliant reds and golds. "When you first climbed up here, I thought you were just another person who wanted to exploit my story for entertainment. I never imagined you were someone who would help me find my way back to meaningful work." Emma looked around at the mountain sanctuary that had become as familiar to her as her own home, at the man who had become her closest collaborator and friend, at the vista that had inspired nearly a century of careful observation by 2 very different people seeking to understand their place in the world. "I came here looking for a story about a hermit," she replied. "Instead, I found a partner in creating something that neither of us could have built alone." As the sun set behind the western peaks and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Emma and Marcus began planning their next project, a comprehensive guide for citizen scientists that would help other long-term observers contribute to academic research while maintaining their independence and protecting the conditions that made their observations possible. The mountain giant had learned to share his stories without leaving his mountain. And Emma Rodriguez had discovered that the most important conversations sometimes happened between just 2 people who understood the value of paying attention to the world around them. The crisis began on a Tuesday morning in March, when Emma received a phone call that would test everything the Long View had built over the past 18 months. The caller was Robert Sterling, a development attorney representing Cascade Vista Corporation. And his message was just devastatingly simple. His clients had purchased the mineral rights beneath Mount Serenity and intended to begin exploratory mining operations within 6 months. Emma stood in her small apartment in Cedar Falls, phone pressed to her ear, watching the mountain through her window as Sterling explained that decades-old mineral rights contracts gave his clients legal authority to access the copper deposits that geological surveys had identified beneath Marcus's property. "Your friend will be compensated for any surface disruption," Sterling said with the practiced neutrality of someone who delivered unwelcome news professionally. "But the mining operation is legally authorized and will proceed regardless of his cooperation." Emma's first instinct was to protect Marcus from this information, to find a legal solution before telling him that his sanctuary was about to be destroyed. But she had learned over their months of collaboration that Marcus valued honest communication above comfortable illusions. That Wednesday, she climbed Mount Serenity carrying legal documents instead of stories, her heart heavy with the knowledge that their weekly meetings might soon come to an end. Marcus was waiting on the porch as always, coffee steaming in the morning air, but his expression told Emma that he already knew something was wrong. After nearly 4 decades of solitary observation, he had developed an acute sensitivity to subtle changes in routine and demeanor. "The mining company called you too," Emma said. It wasn't a question. Marcus nodded. Yesterday afternoon. They want to start with geological surveys next month, then begin excavation in the fall. He gestured toward the forest that surrounded his cabin. They showed me maps of where they plan to dig. It will destroy everything: the watershed, the wildlife corridors, the research sites where I've been collecting data for 37 years. Emma sat down heavily in her chair, feeling the weight of impending loss. There has to be something we can do. Legal challenges, environmental protection laws, something. I've been researching all night, Marcus replied, pulling out a stack of printed documents. The mineral rights are ironclad. They were established in 1952, long before any environmental protection legislation. The company has every legal right to proceed. For the first time since Emma had known him, Marcus looked defeated. His shoulders sagged with the burden of watching his life's work about to be erased by machinery and profit margins. The mountain sanctuary that had enabled his scientific observations, his artistic expression, and his gradual healing from tragedy was going to be reduced to an open-pit mine. What will you do? Emma asked. Marcus stared out at the forest, his expression distant. I don't know. I suppose I'll have to find somewhere else to go. Start over. The thought of Marcus leaving Mount Serenity, of abandoning nearly 4 decades of environmental documentation, of severing the connections he had built with the Longview's community of citizen scientists, was unbearable to Emma. But more than that, it represented a profound injustice: the destruction of irreplaceable scientific knowledge for short-term economic gain. What if we don't let them? Emma said suddenly. Marcus looked at her with surprise. Emma, this isn't a story you can write your way out of. These are legal contracts backed by corporate lawyers and mining equipment. No, but it's a story worth fighting for, Emma replied, her journalism instincts finally kicking in after the initial shock. And we have something the mining company doesn't. What's that? We have a community of people who understand the value of long-term observation. We have scientific collaborators who depend on your data. We have readers who care about preserving the conditions that make citizen science possible. Emma's mind was racing, connections forming between disparate elements of their work over the past year. What if we turn this into a test case for protecting citizen science research sites? The plan that emerged over the following weeks was audacious in its scope and ambition. Instead of fighting the mining company through traditional legal channels, Emma and Marcus would leverage the network they had built through the Longview to create public pressure for protecting sites of long-term environmental research. Dr. Richardson proved to be their first and most powerful ally. When Emma explained the situation to her, the climate scientist immediately understood the scientific implications of destroying Marcus's research site. This isn't just about one person's observations, Dr. Richardson said during an emergency meeting at the Research Institute. Marcus's data represents the longest continuous environmental monitoring record in this region. The loss of his research site would be equivalent to burning down a library that contains irreplaceable historical documents. Dr. Richardson mobilized her academic network with remarkable speed. Within 2 weeks, Emma had collected letters of support from climatologists, ecologists, and environmental researchers from universities across the Pacific Northwest. Each letter emphasized the unique scientific value of Marcus's long-term observations and the irreplaceable nature of his research site. But the most compelling support came from an unexpected source: Marcus's fellow citizen scientists. Helen Vasquez organized her colleagues at Cedar Falls General Hospital to document how Marcus's weather predictions had helped them prepare for medical emergencies during severe storms. Patricia Kellerman gathered testimonials from Toledo community members who had benefited from her social observations, demonstrating how citizen science contributed to community well-being. Jiang Wei's family, through Dorothy Chun, provided historical Documentation showing how immigrant observers had contributed to environmental understanding for over a century, establishing a precedent for protecting sites of cultural and scientific significance. The long View's readership responded with letters, emails, and social media campaigns that caught the attention of environmental journalists and advocacy organizations. Emma found herself coordinating a movement that had grown far beyond anything she could have imagined when she first climbed Mount Serenity. The breakthrough came when Dr. Richardson introduced Emma to Senator Catherine Walsh, who chaired the Senate Subcommittee on Environmental Protection. Senator Walsh had been looking for opportunities to strengthen legislation protecting citizen science, and Marcus's situation provided the perfect test case. What you're describing is a gap in environmental law, Senator Walsh explained during a phone conference with Emma and Dr. Richardson. We protect national parks, wilderness areas, and some research sites. But we don't protect long-term citizen science research that doesn't fit traditional categories. Senator Walsh proposed introducing emergency legislation that would create a new category of protection for sites of ongoing citizen science research. The bill would require environmental impact assessments for any development that would disrupt long-term citizen research projects, and it would provide federal funding to compensate property owners who agreed to maintain citizen science sites. Legislation moved through Congress with surprising speed, aided by growing public awareness of Marcus's situation and strong bipartisan support for protecting citizen science. Environmental groups rallied behind the bill as a way to strengthen community-based environmental monitoring, while conservative legislators supported it as a way to reduce government spending on research by leveraging citizen volunteers. But the mining company wasn't waiting for legislative solutions. Cascade Vista Corporation announced that they would begin geological surveys in June, regardless of pending legislation. Their lawyers argued that existing contracts couldn't be superseded by new environmental laws, and they threatened to sue the federal government for damages if their operations were delayed. The situation reached a crisis point in late May, when survey crews arrived at the base of Mount Serenity with equipment trucks and legal authorization to begin preparatory work. Emma found herself coordinating with environmental lawyers, managing media interviews, and organizing protests, all while trying to support Marcus as he watched his sanctuary being invaded by strangers. I never wanted to be the center of this kind of attention, Marcus told Emma during what they both feared might be their last Wednesday meeting on the mountain. Survey stakes now marked trees throughout the forest, and the sound of chainsaws clearing access roads echoed from the valley below. I know, Emma replied. But sometimes fighting for what matters requires accepting attention you never wanted. Marcus looked around at his property, now scarred with survey markings and access paths. The irony is that all this publicity and legal activity is destroying the quiet observation that made this place valuable in the first place. Even if we win, I'm not sure I can continue my research with all this external attention. Emma realized that Marcus was facing an impossible choice: accept the destruction of his research site, or fight to save it in ways that would fundamentally alter the nature of his work. Either path led to the end of the solitary observation that had defined his life for nearly 4 decades. The resolution came from an unexpected direction. Senator Walsh's legislation passed both houses of Congress in early June, creating federal protection for citizen science research sites. But rather than applying the new law to Marcus's situation retroactively, she proposed a different solution. What if we create a new model? Senator Walsh suggested during a conference call with Emma, Marcus, and Dr. Richardson. What if the federal government purchases the mineral rights from Cascade Vista Corporation and designates Mount Serenity as the nation's first citizen science research preserve? The proposal was unprecedented, a federally protected area designed specifically to support long-term citizen research, with Marcus serving as the preserve's first research fellow. He would maintain his solitude and continue his observations, but with federal protection and modest funding that would support his work while preserving his independence. Cascade. Vista Corporation agreed to sell their mineral rights to the federal government for fair market value, avoiding the costly legal battles that would have resulted from challenging the new environmental legislation. The mining company received compensation for their investment, while the mountain remained protected from development. The designation process took 3 months to complete, during which Emma found herself testifying before congressional committees, coordinating with federal agencies, and managing media attention that had grown far beyond anything the Longview had ever received. But the most meaningful moment came on a quiet Wednesday morning in September, when she climbed Mount Serenity, to find Marcus waiting on his porch with coffee and a new wooden sign that read, "Mount Serenity Citizen Science Research Preserve, established 2024. How does it feel to be the nation's first citizen science research fellow?" Emma asked as they settled into their familiar routine. Marcus smiled, the first genuinely relaxed expression she had seen from him in months. "Like I can finally stop worrying about protecting this place and get back to learning from it." The battle to save Marcus's research site had transformed the Longview from a magazine into a movement. The legislation protecting citizen science research had created new opportunities for long-term observers across the country, while the Mount Serenity Preserve had established a model for federal support of citizen research. More importantly, the crisis had demonstrated that patient, careful observation, the kind of work that Marcus, Helen, Patricia, and dozens of other citizen scientists practiced quietly and without recognition, had genuine value that communities would fight to protect. Emma's role had evolved as well. She was no longer just a journalist telling stories about overlooked experts. She had become an advocate for the institutional changes necessary to support and protect citizen science. The Longview now served as a clearinghouse for citizen scientists, seeking academic collaboration, legal protection, and community support for their research. "I have something for you," Marcus said, disappearing into his cabin and returning with a carved wooden box. Inside, Emma found a set of detailed maps showing the locations of citizen scientists across the Pacific Northwest, dozens of people conducting long-term observations of everything from urban wildlife to social changes in small communities. "These are all people who contacted me after reading about our work," Marcus explained. "Observers who have been working in isolation for years, documenting changes that no one else is paying attention to. I thought you might want to visit some of them." Emma studied the maps, seeing not just locations but potential stories, possible collaborations, and a network of patient observers who had been waiting for someone to recognize the value of their work. "This is incredible," she said. "There are so many more of us than I realized." "That's what I learned during these past few months," Marcus replied. "Fighting to protect one citizen scientist's work revealed how many citizen scientists exist. We're not isolated individuals anymore. We're a community that's finally becoming visible to itself." As Emma prepared to leave that afternoon, she realized that their Wednesday meetings had evolved into something neither of them had anticipated. What had begun as simple storytelling had become a platform for social change, transforming how society recognized and supported the patient. Careful observation that citizens conducted outside formal institutions. The mountain giant had kept his promise to the woods, maintaining deep observation while finding ways to share what he had learned. And Emma Rodriguez had discovered that the most important stories were often the ones that inspired communities to protect the conditions that made storytelling possible. Mount Serenity stood secure under federal protection, its citizen scientist fellow continuing the work of watching, learning, and understanding that he had begun nearly 4 decades earlier. But now his observations contributed to a growing movement that valued patience over speed, depth over sensation, and the wisdom that came from paying attention to the world with sustained care and respect. years after Mount Serenity became the nation's first citizen science research preserve, Emma found herself standing in the lobby of the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., holding an invitation that still seemed surreal. The National Museum of Natural History wanted to create an exhibit called The Watchers, America's Hidden Scientists, and they had asked Emma to serve as the primary curator. The exhibition would showcase citizen scientists from across the United States, people like Marcus, Helen, and Patricia, whose long-term observations had contributed to scientific understanding despite working outside traditional academic institutions. But more than that, it would demonstrate how patient, sustained attention could reveal truths that formal research often missed. "We want to change how people think about expertise," explained Dr. Maria Santos, the museum's director of contemporary science exhibits. "Your magazine has documented dozens of citizen scientists whose work rivals anything produced in university laboratories. We think the public needs to understand that valuable scientific knowledge doesn't always come from people with advanced degrees." Emma walked through the museum's halls, past displays of dinosaur fossils and mineral collections, imagining how Marcus's carved wildlife sculptures might look in these spaces, how Helen's documentation of medical intuition could be presented alongside formal medical research, how Patricia's conversation notebooks could illustrate the evolution of American social patterns. But the project raised complex questions about representation and consent. Many of the Longview citizen scientists had chosen their work precisely because it allowed them to contribute to knowledge without seeking public recognition. Would featuring them in a National Museum exhibit violate the very privacy and independence that had made their observations possible? Emma returned to Oregon with mixed feelings about the exhibition proposal. During her next Wednesday visit to Mount Serenity, she found Marcus experimenting with a new form of documentation, time-lapse photography of seasonal changes in specific forest locations. He had set up cameras at 12 different sites around his property, capturing images every 6 hours to create visual records of how climate change was affecting vegetation patterns. "It's a different kind of observation," Marcus explained as they reviewed months of footage on his laptop. "Instead of writing about changes I notice, I'm creating visual evidence that other people can see and interpret for themselves." The time-lapse sequences were mesmerizing: trees leafing out earlier each spring, snow melting faster each winter, wildflowers blooming in altered sequences that reflected shifting temperature patterns. Marcus had inadvertently created an artistic representation of climate change that was both scientifically valuable and emotionally powerful. "The Smithsonian wants to feature your work in a national exhibition," Emma said, showing Marcus the proposal materials. "But I'm not sure how you'd feel about that level of public attention." Marcus studied the exhibition plans carefully, his expression thoughtful. 2 years ago, I would have refused immediately. But saving this place taught me something about the relationship between private observation and public responsibility." "What do you mean?" "I mean that knowledge belongs to more than just the person who discovers it," Marcus replied. "My observations about climate change, Helen's insights about medical intuition, Patricia's documentation of social patterns, these discoveries only matter if they reach people who can use them to make better decisions." Emma realized that Marcus was articulating something she had been struggling to understand about the Longview's evolution. The magazine had begun as a platform for overlooked individuals to share their expertise, but it had become something larger, a bridge between private knowledge and public benefit. "So you'd participate in the exhibition?" Marcus smiled. "I'd participate in the exhibition, but I wouldn't attend the opening reception or give interviews or travel to Washington. The work can be public even if the worker remains private." This became the guiding principle for the Smithsonian exhibition. Emma spent the next 6 months working with citizen scientists across the country to develop displays that honored their discoveries while respecting their choices about personal privacy. Some contributors, like Helen Vasquez, were eager to share their stories publicly and agreed to participate in educational programs. Others, like Patricia Kellerman, preferred to remain anonymous while allowing their work to be featured. The most challenging case was Jiang Wei's family. Dorothy Chen had agreed to include her grandfather's environmental observations in climate research, but she was hesitant about displaying his personal journals in a museum, where thousands of strangers would read his private thoughts about adapting to life in America. Emma proposed a compromise that became a model for ethical representation in the exhibition. Jiang Wei's scientific observations would be featured prominently, with full credit to his contributions to environmental understanding. But his personal reflections would be represented through commissioned artwork that captured the emotional content of his immigration experience without reproducing his actual words. The artist chosen for this project was Maya Patel, a second-generation immigrant whose grandparents had also documented their new homeland through careful observation and note-taking. Maya created a series of mixed-media pieces that combined Jiang Wei's environmental data with abstract representations of cultural adaptation, creating works that honored both his scientific contributions and his human journey. As the exhibition took shape, Emma discovered that citizen scientists represented far more diversity than she had initially realized. The Smithsonian Project connected her with urban beekeepers tracking pollution through bee behavior, tribal elders documenting traditional ecological knowledge, retired teachers monitoring bird migration patterns, and immigrant communities recording changes in their neighborhoods over decades. Each contributor brought unique perspectives shaped by their backgrounds, communities, and circumstances. A formerly incarcerated man named James Crawford had spent 15 years documenting urban wildlife in Detroit, learning to see resilience and adaptation in abandoned lots that most people considered wastelands. A group of elderly women in rural Mississippi had been tracking changes in local plant medicines for 40 years, preserving knowledge that pharmaceutical researchers were just beginning to value. What strikes me about all these citizen scientists, Emma told Dr. Santos during one of their planning meetings, is that they're not trying to become famous or build careers. They're driven by curiosity and care for their communities. They observe because they love what they're observing. Dr. Santos nodded. That's exactly why their work is so valuable. They have relationships with their subjects that academic researchers often can't develop because of time constraints and institutional pressures. The exhibition opened in September with a reception that Emma attended on behalf of the citizen scientists who preferred to remain private. She found herself surrounded by academic researchers, environmental advocates, and curious visitors who were encountering citizen science for the first time. The displays were more powerful than Emma had expected. Marcus's time-lapse photography played on screens throughout the exhibition, showing decades of environmental change in fast-forward sequences that made abstract climate data viscerally real. Helen's medical observations were presented alongside testimonials from patients whose lives had been saved by her intuitive interventions. Patricia's conversation patterns were displayed as interactive maps showing how social changes rippled through small communities over time. But the centerpiece of the exhibition was a recreation of Marcus's mountain workshop, complete with his carved wildlife sculptures, environmental charts, and observation journals. Visitors could sit in a replica of his porch chair and look out at a painted panorama of Mount Serenity while listening to audio recordings of his environmental observations. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The exhibition drew record crowds, with many visitors spending hours examining the detailed documentation that citizen scientists had produced through patient, sustained observation. Environmental journalists wrote articles about the scientific value of citizen research. Academic institutions contacted Emma about collaborating with citizen scientists in their regions. More importantly, the exhibition inspired new citizen scientists. The museum received hundreds of emails from people who wanted to begin their own long-term observation projects, from urban gardeners tracking pollinator behavior to suburban neighbors documenting local bird populations. Emma found herself coordinating a national network of citizen scientists that had grown far beyond anything she could have imagined when she first climbed Mount Serenity. The Long View had evolved from a magazine into a movement, and now it was becoming an institution that supported citizen research across the United States. But the most meaningful response came from Marcus himself. During Emma's first Wednesday visit after the exhibition opened, she found him reading emails from visitors who had been inspired by his work to begin their own environmental observations. "Listen to this," Marcus said, reading from his laptop. "A high school teacher in Vermont is setting up time-lapse cameras around her school to document seasonal changes. A retirement community in Arizona is organizing to monitor desert wildlife. A group of farmers in Iowa wants to document soil health changes over time." Emma realized that Marcus's example of patient, sustained observation was replicating itself across the country. People were learning that they didn't need advanced degrees or expensive equipment to contribute to scientific understanding. They just needed curiosity, patience, and commitment to paying attention. "There's something else," Marcus continued, opening a different email. "The European Space Agency wants to collaborate with citizen scientists on climate monitoring. They're developing satellite programs that could complement ground-based observations like mine. They want to create a global network of citizen climate observers." The possibility of international collaboration represented a new phase in the citizen science movement that Emma and Marcus had helped create. Instead of isolated individuals conducting private observations, citizen scientists could become part of coordinated research networks that spanned continents and combined local knowledge with global data. But Marcus had concerns about this expansion. "I worry that organizing citizen science into formal networks might destroy the independence and spontaneity that makes it valuable," he told Emma. "If citizen scientists become just unpaid research assistants for academic institutions, we might lose the creative insights that come from unstructured observation." Emma understood his concern. The Long View's success had been built on respecting the autonomy of citizen scientists, while facilitating collaboration with academic researchers. Scaling that model to international networks would require careful attention to maintaining the balance between coordination and independence. "What if we created guidelines for citizen science collaboration?" Emma suggested. "Principles that protect observer autonomy while enabling productive partnerships with academic institutions?" They spent the afternoon drafting what would become known as the Mount Serenity Principles for Citizen Science Ethics, a framework for collaboration that prioritized the independence of citizen observers while facilitating knowledge sharing and institutional support. The principles establish that citizen scientists should maintain ownership of their data and methods, should have veto power over how their work was used, and should be recognized as full collaborators rather than volunteer assistants. Academic institutions that wanted to work with citizen scientists would need to adapt their research practices to respect these principles. Emma presented the Mount Serenity Principles at a conference on citizen science held at the Smithsonian the following month. The framework was adopted by research institutions across the United States and eventually became the international standard for ethical citizen science collaboration. As Emma's train carried her back to Oregon after the conference, she reflected on how far their work had traveled from its origins in simple Wednesday morning conversations on a mountain porch. What had begun as personal storytelling between two isolated individuals had grown into a movement that was changing how scientific knowledge was created, validated, and shared. Back on Mount Serenity, Marcus continued his environmental observations with the same patience and attention he had practiced for 4 decades. But now his work was part of a global network of citizen scientists whose combined observations were contributing to humanity's understanding of environmental change, social evolution, and the complex relationships between human communities and natural systems. The mountain giant had learned to share his stories without leaving his mountain. And Emma Rodriguez had discovered that the most important conversations were often the ones that inspired thousands of other conversations between people who had never met, but shared a commitment to paying attention to the world around them. Longview had become more than a magazine or even a movement. It had become a new way of understanding how knowledge was created through the patient, sustained attention of ordinary people doing extraordinary work in communities across the globe. 5 years after Emma first climbed Mount Serenity, she found herself facing a crisis that threatened everything they had built together. The success of the Longview and the citizen science movement had attracted the attention of venture capitalists who saw profit potential in what Emma and Marcus had created through years of careful, uncommercial work. The offer came through Nathaniel Brooks, a tech entrepreneur who had made his fortune developing apps that monetized user-generated content. Brooks had been following the Longview's growth and believed he could scale their model into a profitable platform that would connect citizen scientists globally while generating revenue through data licensing and subscription services. "You're sitting on a gold mine," Brooks told Emma during their meeting at a Portland coffee shop. He spread tablets and financial projections across the small table, his enthusiasm filling the space between them. "Citizen science is the future of research, cheap, distributed, passionate. But you're thinking too small." Emma studied Brooks's proposal with growing unease. He wanted to transform the Longview into a digital platform called crowdscience that would gamify citizen research, offering points and rewards for data collection, creating competitive leaderboards for observation accuracy, and selling aggregated data to corporations and government agencies. "We could have 1 million citizen scientists within 2 years, Brooks continued. "Imagine the data collection power, the research efficiency, the market value of all that information." But everything about Brooks's vision contradicted the principles that had made the Longview successful. His platform would prioritize quantity over quality, speed over patience, competition over collaboration. The careful, sustained attention that characterized Marcus's work would be replaced by rapid data collection optimized for algorithmic processing. "I need to discuss this with my partner," Emma said, gathering Brooks's materials. "Your hermit friend on the mountain?" Brooks smiled with the condescension of someone who viewed rural isolation as quaint but irrelevant. "Look, I understand he's been important to your origin story, but scaling requires professional management. We'd keep him as a symbolic figurehead. Maybe feature him in marketing materials, but real growth needs real business expertise." Emma felt something cold settle in her stomach. Brooks saw Marcus not as a collaborator, but as a mascot, a colorful character to be exploited for brand authenticity, while real decisions were made by people who understood neither citizen science nor the relationships that sustained it. That Wednesday, Emma climbed Mount Serenity with a heavy heart, carrying Brooks's proposal and a growing certainty that accepting his offer would destroy everything meaningful about their work. She found Marcus in his workshop, carefully cataloging seeds he had collected from plants that were beginning to bloom earlier each year due to climate change. "Venture capital," Marcus said after Emma explained the meeting. He didn't look up from his seed collection, but his voice carried a weariness that went beyond simple fatigue. "I wondered when this would happen. You're not surprised?" "I've been watching the Longview's growth for 5 years, Marcus replied. "I've seen how success attracts people who want to monetize whatever they don't understand. The question is, what we do about it." Emma spread Brooks's materials across Marcus's work table, the glossy financial projections looking absurd next to hand-labeled seed packets and field notebooks. "He's offering enough money to fund citizen science research for decades. We could establish grants, support struggling observers, create educational programs. We could, Marcus agreed. But would any of that happen once Brooks controlled the platform? Or would citizen scientists just become unpaid data collectors for corporate clients? Marcus set down his magnifying glass and looked directly at Emma. I've been thinking about legacy lately. What happens to this work when we're gone? How do we ensure that the principles we've established survive the inevitable pressures to commercialize and scale? The question had been haunting Emma as well. She was now 41 years old, and Marcus was approaching 70. The citizen science movement they had helped create was growing rapidly, but growth brought vulnerabilities. Without careful stewardship, their network of independent observers could easily become just another extractive industry, harvesting local knowledge for distant profit. What if we don't try to control the growth? Emma suggested. What if we focus on creating something that can't be purchased or corrupted? Over the following weeks, Emma and Marcus developed a response to Brooks's offer that surprised everyone, including themselves. Instead of rejecting his proposal outright, they would accept his funding but use it to create something unprecedented, a citizen science, commons that would permanently protect the independence and autonomy of citizen researchers. The Mount Serenity Foundation would be structured as a permanent trust, funded by Brooks's investment, but governed by principles that prevented commercial exploitation of citizen science. The foundation would provide grants to citizen scientists, facilitate collaboration with academic institutions, and maintain ethical standards for citizen research, all while ensuring that contributors retained complete ownership of their work and methods. Brooks was initially resistant to the foundation structure, preferring direct ownership of the platform and its data. But Emma and Marcus had learned from their experience with the mining company that public pressure could overcome corporate preferences. They announced the foundation publicly, with endorsements from academic researchers, environmental organizations, and citizen scientists worldwide. The announcement created a media sensation that neither Emma nor Marcus had anticipated. The story of two people refusing to commercialize citizen science while using venture capital to create permanent protections for citizen researchers captured public imagination in ways that surprised everyone involved. You're turning down millions of dollars to preserve principles? Asked Rebecca Martinez, the CNN journalist interviewing Emma via satellite from Mount Serenity. In today's economy, isn't that impractical idealism? Emma looked at the camera, aware that Marcus was listening from inside his cabin, but trusting her to represent their shared values accurately. We're not turning down money. We're using money to build something more valuable than profit, a permanent infrastructure for supporting citizen science that can't be bought, sold, or corrupted by future commercial interests. The interview was broadcast nationwide, generating thousands of emails from people who wanted to support the foundation's mission. More importantly, it attracted the attention of other philanthropists who shared Emma and Marcus's vision of protecting citizen science from commercial exploitation. Within 6 months, the Mount Serenity Foundation had received donations from environmental foundations, academic institutions, and individual contributors worldwide. The original investment from Brooks, who eventually agreed to the foundation structure, rather than lose the opportunity entirely, had grown into a permanent endowment that could support citizen science indefinitely. But the foundation's most innovative feature was its governance structure. Instead of being controlled by wealthy donors or institutional representatives, the foundation was governed by citizen scientists themselves. Marcus served as the founding director, but policy decisions were made by a council of citizen researchers, elected by their peers worldwide. Helen Vasquez was elected to represent medical citizen science, bringing her insights about intuitive healthcare to foundation policy. Patricia Kellerman represented social observation, advocating for citizen scientists studying community changes and cultural evolution. Jiang Wei's story was honored through Dorothy Chen's election to represent historical citizen science. Immigrant contributions to environmental understanding. The council met annually at Mount Serenity, gathering in the meadow below Marcus's cabin to discuss grants, ethical guidelines, and strategies for supporting citizen research globally. These meetings became legendary in the citizen science, community democratic gatherings, where janitors who studied urban ecology had equal voice with retired professors who monitored bird migration. Emma found herself serving as the Foundation's executive director, coordinating between the Citizen Scientist Council and academic institutions worldwide. But her most important role remained unchanged. She continued climbing Mount Serenity every Wednesday to meet with Marcus, sharing stories and developing new approaches to supporting patient-sustained observation. During one of these meetings, 3 years after the Foundation's establishment, Marcus showed Emma a letter that had arrived from an unexpected source. Dr. Amanda Richardson, the climate scientist who had first collaborated with Marcus, was writing to inform them that his 4 decades of environmental observations had been cited in the latest report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Your data provided crucial evidence for understanding long-term temperature trends in the Pacific Northwest, Richardson wrote. The IPCC report specifically acknowledges citizen science contributions, citing Mount Serenity as a model for how individual observers can contribute to global climate understanding. Emma realized that Marcus's patient documentation of seasonal changes, weather patterns, and ecological relationships had become part of humanity's official record of climate change. His observations, begun as a form of grief therapy and continued through decades of solitude, were now helping shape international environmental policy. How does it feel to know that your work is influencing global climate policy? Emma asked. Marcus was quiet for a long time, looking out at the forest that had been his laboratory and sanctuary for over 40 years. It feels like the conversation I started with this place has become a conversation with the world, he said finally. But I'm glad the world is finally listening. The Foundation's success had created new challenges as well as opportunities. Citizen science was becoming institutionalized, with universities creating citizen science departments and government agencies developing citizen researcher programs. While this recognition was gratifying, it also risked transforming spontaneous observation into bureaucratic data collection. Emma and Marcus worked carefully to maintain the balance between supporting citizen science and controlling it. The Foundation provided resources and recognition without imposing methodologies or research agendas. Citizen scientists remained free to pursue whatever questions interested them, using whatever methods worked in their particular circumstances. This approach attracted criticism from some academic researchers who preferred more standardized approaches to citizen science. During a conference at Stanford University, Dr. Jeremy Walsh, a prominent research methodology expert, challenged Emma's presentation about the Foundation's work. How can you ensure data quality when citizen scientists use inconsistent methods? Walsh asked. How can we trust observations that aren't peer-reviewed or verified through controlled studies? Emma's response reflected years of experience working with citizen scientists whose insights had proven more accurate than formal research. We ensure quality by supporting long-term relationships between observers and what they observe. A nurse who's worked the same hospital ward for 20 years knows things about patient care that controlled studies can't capture. A farmer who's monitored soil health for decades understands agricultural systems in ways that laboratory research can't replicate. But without standardized methodology, how do we know their observations are accurate? We know because their observations produce results, Emma replied. Helen Vasquez's medical intuition saves lives. Marcus Thorne's weather predictions help communities prepare for storms. Patricia Kellerman's social observations help neighborhoods understand demographic changes. Accuracy isn't just about methodology, it's about practical outcomes. The exchange highlighted ongoing tensions between institutional science and citizen research, but it also demonstrated how far the citizen science movement had progressed in gaining academic respect. 5 years earlier, Marcus's environmental observations had been dismissed as anecdotal. Now they were cited in international climate reports and used by universities worldwide. As Emma's train carried her back to Oregon after the Stanford conference, she reflected on how the relationship between formal and informal science was evolving. Citizen scientists were no longer outsiders seeking recognition from academic institutions. They had become partners in collaborative research that combined institutional resources with community knowledge. Back on Mount Serenity, Marcus continued his environmental observations with the same patience and attention he had practiced for over 4 decades. But now his work was part of a global network of citizen scientists whose combined observations were contributing to humanity's understanding of climate change, social evolution, and the complex relationships between human communities and natural systems. The mountain giant had learned that sharing stories didn't require leaving the mountain. Sometimes the most important contributions came from staying in one place long enough to understand it deeply, then finding ways to connect that understanding with others who were doing similar work in different places. Emma Rodriguez had discovered that the best journalism created communities rather than just informing audiences. The Long View had evolved from a magazine into a movement, and then into an institution that protected the conditions necessary for patient, sustained observation. To flourish, their Wednesday conversations continued, now entering their 6th year with no sign of ending. Each week brought new stories, new insights, and new connections between citizen scientists worldwide who were learning to value slow observation in a fast world, deep attention in a distracted age, and collaborative knowledge in an era that too often prioritized individual achievement over community wisdom. 10 years after, Emma Rodriguez first climbed Mount Serenity with nothing but a laptop and a desperate need for someone to listen to her stories. She found herself preparing for a conversation she had never wanted to have. Marcus Thorne, now 74 years old, had been diagnosed with early-stage Parkinson's disease, and they needed to discuss what would happen to his 4 decades of environmental observations when he could no longer maintain them. The diagnosis had come during a routine medical examination that Marcus had finally agreed to after years of Emma's gentle insistence. The tremor in his hands, which he had attributed to age and cold mountain mornings, was actually the beginning of a progressive neurological condition that would eventually make his precise documentation impossible. "The irony isn't lost on me," Marcus said as they sat on his porch during what had become their 520th Wednesday meeting. "I've spent 43 years documenting change in everything around me, and now I have to document the changes in myself." Emma had been dreading this moment since the diagnosis, not because she feared Marcus's mortality, though that grief was real, but because she couldn't imagine Mount Serenity without him. His presence had become so integral to the mountain's identity that the idea of the place continuing without him seemed impossible. "What do you want to happen to your research?" Emma asked gently. Marcus gestured toward his cabin, where decades of observations filled filing cabinets, bookshelves, and computer drives. "The data belongs to the Foundation now. But the real question is whether someone else can continue the observations from this specific location, or whether my work ends when I do." This was the challenge that had been weighing on Emma's mind. For months, Marcus's observations were valuable, precisely because they represented continuous monitoring from a single location over an unprecedented time span. If the observations stopped, the continuity would be broken. If someone else took over, the methodology and perspective would inevitably change. "I have an idea," Emma said, "but I need to know if you'd be comfortable with a different kind of succession." Over the following hour, Emma outlined a proposal that represented a fundamental evolution in how citizen science could be sustained across generations. Instead of trying to find a single replacement for Marcus, they would create a residential fellowship program that would bring different citizen scientists to Mount Serenity for extended periods, each contributing their own expertise while maintaining the long-term environmental observations. The Mount Serenity Fellowship would be administered by the Foundation, with fellows selected not for their formal credentials, but for their demonstrated commitment to patient, sustained observation. A marine biologist studying ocean acidification could spend a year on the mountain, contributing coastal perspectives to Marcus's terrestrial observations. An urban ecologist documenting city wildlife could bring insights about human-environment interactions. A traditional knowledge keeper from an indigenous community could add cultural perspectives to environmental monitoring. Each fellow would maintain the core observations that you've established, Emma explained. But they'd also contribute their own areas of expertise, creating a more comprehensive understanding of environmental change than any single observer could achieve. Marcus was intrigued by the concept, but concerned about maintaining continuity. How do we ensure that 43 years of methodology doesn't get lost when different people take over? Emma had anticipated this concern. We create a comprehensive documentation of your methods, not just what you observe, but how and why you observe it. We record you explaining your techniques, your decision-making processes, your interpretive frameworks. Future fellows would be trained in your approaches before beginning their residencies. The project took 6 months to complete, during which Emma spent extended periods on Mount Serenity, documenting Marcus's observational practices with video cameras, audio recorders, and detailed written protocols. The resulting archive captured not just the technical aspects of his work, but the philosophical and emotional approaches that had sustained his observations for over 4 decades. More importantly, the documentation process allowed Marcus to reflect on what he had learned during his years of solitude and how that knowledge could be transmitted to others who chose different paths to understanding. The most important thing I've learned, Marcus told Emma during one of their recording sessions, is that real observation requires love. You can't understand something you don't care about, and you can't care about something you don't spend time with. The technical methods matter, but they're meaningless without the emotional commitment to actually see what you're looking at. The first Mount Serenity Fellow was Dr. Sarah Blackhorse, a Navajo ecologist who had spent 15 years documenting traditional plant medicines on tribal lands in Arizona. She arrived at the mountain in early spring, spending 3 months learning Marcus's methods before beginning her own year-long residency. Emma watched Marcus train Sarah with a mixture of pride and melancholy. His tremor was becoming more pronounced, making the precise handwriting that had characterized his observations increasingly difficult. But his knowledge and insights remained sharp, and he threw himself into the teaching role with the enthusiasm of someone passing on precious knowledge to a worthy successor. Sarah brings perspectives I never could have developed, Marcus told Emma after Sarah had been on the mountain for 2 months. She sees plant communities as medicine systems, animal behavior as spiritual communication, seasonal changes as ceremonial cycles. She's maintaining my observations while adding layers of understanding that make them richer than they've ever been. The fellowship program's success led to applications from citizen scientists worldwide. The Foundation received requests from observers studying everything from Arctic ice changes to tropical rainforest biodiversity, all seeking the opportunity to contribute to the longest-running citizen science project in North America while learning from its founder. But Emma knew that the program's real test would come when Marcus was no longer able to participate directly. That moment arrived sooner than anyone had expected. During the winter of the fellowship program's 2nd year, Marcus fell while collecting firewood, injuring his back severely enough to require extended medical treatment in Portland. For the first time in over 40 years, Mount Serenity was without its primary observer, dependent entirely on the current fellow Dr. James Littlewolf, a Menominee ethnobotanist, to maintain the continuity of observations. Emma visited Marcus in the hospital, finding him frustrated by his forced separation from the mountain, but gratified by reports from James about the continuation of his work. "He's seeing things I missed," Marcus said, reading from James's detailed reports about winter plant survival strategies and snowpack variations. 43 years of observation, and I'm still learning new things about that place through someone else's eyes. When Marcus was finally able to return to Mount Serenity 3 months later, he found that the mountain's scientific identity had evolved rather than simply continuing. James had maintained all of Marcus's core observations while adding detailed documentation of indigenous plant uses that provided new context for understanding ecological relationships. "This is what succession should look like," Marcus told Emma during their first Wednesday meeting after his return. "Not replacement, but expansion. Not ending, but transformation." Marcus's health continued to decline gradually over the following 2 years, but his spirit remained engaged with the mountain and its ongoing research. He served as mentor to successive fellows, each bringing new expertise, while maintaining the long-term observations that anchored the site's scientific value. Emma documented this transition carefully, recognizing that they were creating a new model for how citizen science could bridge individual mortality and institutional permanence. The Mount Serenity Fellowship had become a template for sustaining long-term observation across generations, allowing the accumulated wisdom of decades to be preserved while enabling continuous evolution and growth. During their final recorded conversation, Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought him from isolated hermit to mentor for a global community of citizen scientists. "When you first climbed up here 10 years ago, I thought my story was ending," he told Emma. "I thought I had failed to share what I'd learned, failed to make my observations useful to anyone else. But our conversations taught me that stories don't end, they just find new voices to continue telling them." Marcus passed away peacefully in his sleep during the spring of the fellowship program's 4th year, with Dr. Elena Vasquez Helen's niece and a restoration ecologist serving as the current Mount Serenity Fellow. The mountain's observations continued without interruption, maintained by hands that had learned his methods while bringing their own insights to the work. Emma spoke at Marcus's memorial service, which was held in the meadow below his cabin and attended by citizen scientists from around the world. She chose to focus not on loss, but on transformation, how one person's patient attention to a single place had inspired a global movement of observers who understood that the most important discoveries often came from staying still long enough to really see. "Marcus taught us that stories find their true meaning when they're shared," Emma said to the gathering of researchers, fellows, and community members who had come to honor his memory. "He spent 43 years learning the mountains' stories, and then he spent his final years teaching others how to listen for stories of their own." The Mount Serenity Citizen Science Research Preserve continued under the Foundation's stewardship, with fellows maintaining the longest continuous environmental observation record in the Pacific Northwest while contributing their own expertise to humanity's understanding of environmental change. Emma continued climbing the mountain every Wednesday, now to meet with current fellows and coordinate the global network of citizen scientists that had grown from her first conversation with a lonely man who had forgotten how to talk to anyone but the trees. The long view had evolved far beyond a magazine or even a movement. It had become a permanent institution for supporting the patient, sustained attention that democracy needed, but rarely rewarded proof that some of the most important work in the world was done by people who chose to watch, listen, and care for the places and communities they called home. And every Wednesday morning, someone climbed Mount Serenity to continue a conversation that had begun with one simple question: "Would you like to hear a story?" Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.